As many of you likely know about me already, I am frequently asking myself the question, what else could I take out of pop culture to turn into a freakier, beastier version of itself? Whether that's making them into SCPs, or fantasy beasts, or dinosaurs, or any other kind of monstery thing. And today I just kinda happened to land on the idea of Dreamworks animated characters. So I'm taking some of my favorites of them and turning them into fantasy monsters. Let's go! Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. I've heard no short supply of legends in my time as a beast chronicler. In fact, it is essentially my charge to seek them out and discover what truths lie behind them. Obviously, the farther back a tale is said to have occurred, the more difficult it is to verify, but with access now to the bestiary of the previous overseer of my world, I now have the ability to confirm some truly unusual tales. One such tale that I've been able to peel back some layers of is that of the last of the Swamp Ogres. They were a species that had intelligence on par with an ape, and some were even seen to don some clothing made from plants or cloth taken from human travelers through their homes. They'd also often have crusted mud covering parts of their body to help regulate their temperature. It's not clear if this was always the case, but for the final century of their existence, they were known to have a very aggressive temperament, especially towards humans. But this may have been because they were hunted to near extinction by us. You see, their hides were very thick and made for excellent material with which to make leathers, and on top of that, their abundant earwax, when blended with other substances, made for surprisingly desirable candles. The last of these creatures was said to live isolated in a Scottish swampland, strangely enough with a stray donkey, perhaps taken from explorers that stepped too far into the ogre's territory. The tales I'd heard of this ogre were that it was lured out of its home by the head of the nearest kingdom and tricked into fighting a dragon that had been ravaging another kingdom, whose princess he fancied and desired to wed. I've heard multiple outcomes to this tale, but according to this bestiary, the true conclusion was that the ogre was unable to slay the dragon, but was mighty enough to scare it off. The dragon then went directly to the next nearest kingdom and wound up devouring the king who'd sent the ogre in the first place. The princess, grateful for the ogre's aid, ensured that its home swamp was made a sanctuary, illegal for hunters to tread on, until the day the ogre died of natural causes. Admittedly, with the number of strange tales I've now learned to be true, this one's outcome actually struck me as quite reasonable. But perhaps that is simply in contrast to the tale to follow, that of a dire panda that could do martial arts. Now with this drawing, I did kind of debate making it more monstery and ape-like or gorilla-like. That's always something I have to think about when I'm doing these episodes of making things more monstrous. How much do I want to push them a little bit more into realistic animal territory? With Shrek, obviously an ogre is very similar shape-wise to a human. So in this one, I kinda just went with, well, let's keep him the same sort of shape, maybe add in a little bit of ape-like elements, but mostly I do keep him just human with the ogre elements, like his ears and stuff. I didn't want to give him a full set of clothing. I felt like that was gonna be just a little bit too similar to Shrek, and lore-wise wouldn't make a ton of sense, but I also figured if he's a very human-looking character, he'd have something between his legs that I probably need to find some way to cover up. So I decided to work in a little bit of, okay, they're a fairly intelligent species, not human intelligent, but enough to, maybe add a bit of clothing to themselves. And then the coated mud on top of him, I felt like that was going to be a fun way to go to add a bit of Shrek's actual clothing without it being clothing on the design. Some elements of his arms feel a little bit awkward pose-wise, but overall I'm fairly happy with that too. And one thing I actually do just after the drawing finishes to make it feel a little bit more like we're looking up at him is in After Effects, where I export all my final drawings and stuff. I make the element 3D and just tilt it a little bit so that his feet are a little bit closer towards us and there is a little bit more of a sense of looking up at a bigger kind of freaky sort of creature. Pretty happy with this as the first drawing, and let's take a look. As a young boy, the story of a Chinese martial artist who was instructed by his mentor to teach a bear to do martial arts was always a very enjoyable one to hear, but when anyone suggested that there was truth to the tale, I always immediately wrote them off. Obviously, I thought it was simply a folk tale used as a metaphor to teach a lesson. Now, I've learned that even this story has truth to it. To be fair, dire pandas are the calmest and most friendly towards humans of all creatures in the dire bear family, but they are still lumbering beasts that will devour a human if they have not been in close proximity to bamboo for an extended period. Even this bestiary is uncertain on some details to this story, as it lists the kung fu practitioner who the tale revolves around as Master Shifu. But given Shifu is the Cantonese word for master, I believe it's possible his name has simply been lost in translation at some point. Still, it says that the truth of this tale is that Shifu was coming to the end of his own training, but needed to learn a lesson in patience. To try and teach him this, his own master instructed him to take the lone dire bear that had always roamed around the woods near their village and teach it kung fu. Shifu scoffed as anyone would at the request, but his master insisted, stating that these creatures were fairly intelligent for the type of beast they were, and that with enough repetition and example, the creature could be made to replicate Shifu's movements. Shifu did as instructed, and the work was infuriating. As expected, the creature did none of what Shifu was trying to teach it, and spent their first weeks barely watching him and simply eating everything in sight, even taking a few lazy swipes at Shifu with its claws. Shifu considered giving up many times, but by sticking to it, he eventually realized that he simply had to utilize something that the bear truly seemed interested in: food. He crafted delectable treats that the bear would be unable to resist, but would only grant the creature a bite when it mimicked one of his movements. It took time for the creature to recognize this pattern, but eventually the lesson did stick. After a year of repetition, the dire bear was genuinely able to replicate over a dozen kung fu techniques. But, more important than that, Shifu himself had become a far more patient person, seeing that persistence and resourcefulness could help him achieve even a seemingly ludicrous task. Now, the most fun part of this drawing that I think helps it to stand out a little bit compared to some of my other ones is the environment around it, where I was pulling inspiration from images right out of Kung Fu Panda, that the background just had some different colors than I would usually use. A lot of the trees had red leaves to them, which I guess I could do that more often in my stuff, setting drawings in a fall sort of setting and have trees with different colored leaves to them. I should keep that in mind. But anyway, red leaf trees and then just a background that's a golden yellow kind of sky, which I have done before, but not super frequently, and I think the pairing of the red trees and golden sky looks really nice in this. In terms of the actual creature, I thought it was going to look a little bit too simple if I didn't add some kind of extra color contrast to it, so I did end up giving it Poe's pants from Kung Fu Panda and the bandages on its legs, and lore-wise, it really does not make sense, but I just thought drawing-wise it was going to look nicer if I added that in. And then besides that, I just had fun with the usual bear stuff, like a big open snarling mouth, a bit of saliva dripping out. Maybe made it look a little bit too menacing for a panda, but it is supposed to be a dire panda, so you know, it's supposed to be a bit more on the menacing side anyway. Love working with Kung Fu Panda again, and I hope you all like the finished result. Quick reminder that all the art from this episode will be available as posters up on the PopCross Studios Teespring store by the time you're watching. Also, the inks and high-resolution versions of these drawings are available up on the PopCross Studios Patreon now. For $5 a month, you get early access to all the art and inks from every episode going forward, as well as access to a backlog of over 500 other inks and high-resolution drawings from the history of the channel. The Teespring store and Patreon are linked in the description. Now back into more art. I only recently started researching again tales of the Dragon Tamer tournaments that took place 1,000 years ago in my world, and doing so prompted me to seek out further tales as far back as I could on dragon riders. Different cultures of my world have different claims that their people were the first to ride or tame dragons, but it is very likely that multiple regions of the world discovered that this was possible around the same time. One set of legends states that the very first to make dragon riding commonplace was a colony of Vikings 6,000 years ago that lived on a system of northern isles. Their lands were surrounded by massive swarms of aggressive dragons that constantly devoured their livestock. These people became very adept at slaying dragons, but it was only when one of their youngest warriors managed to aid and befriend a dragon that they were able to dissuade the others from consuming their resources. Soon after, more dragon riders were trained, and it eventually became a rite of passage into adulthood for a young Viking of these villages to train a dragon themselves. The dragon that the original Viking from these tales tamed was one that, at the time, they called a furious nightmare. Though, after its domestication, it was discovered that the name was likely too aggressive for the beast. That's not to say that it lacked power, though. The creature was both very strong for its size and incredibly fast, so much so that some writings suggest that at full speed it was practically imperceptible to the human eye. Some even claim that it could teleport, or perhaps turn invisible, but I believe that these are simply conclusions come to as a result of its incredible speed. It could also shoot very quick and incredibly hot bursts of blue flame that would erupt against their targets on impact. It even, strangely enough, had retractable teeth, though I've found no theories from beast chroniclers in that day to explain what the biological benefits of this were. Females of this species were said to be pearl white, while the males, and the one referred to in this tale, were night black. Some stories say that these Vikings eventually moved their home and parted ways with their dragon riding traditions, but writings to prove this are sporadic and difficult to locate. I don't believe it would be possible for me at this point to determine if this civilization was indeed the first to take up dragon riding, but it is certainly fascinating to know how far back the tradition goes. Now, to be totally honest, I'm kinda disappointed with how this one turned out. Not because I think it looks bad at the end, but just because it's such a concept that feels so fitting for what I do on this channel, taking Toothless and making him into a more monstrous kind of dragon, that it really feels like something that should have turned out awesome. And what's interesting is that I actually do like most of the design elements that I used in this. The big problem with it for me is just the pose. I messed around with it a bit, but I feel like I probably should have done this one in landscape, just thinking about the shape of Toothless's body, him being a dragon that stands on 4 legs more commonly. I think maybe looking at the character lengthwise, maybe even looking at the dragon from above, looking at his back might have been a better way to go about it, but just the flow of this one feels a little bit off to me. It feels like it's swooping too much, and there are too many limbs that are overlapping in awkward ways, and because he's such a unified color, even though I do add more green elements to kind of vary him up a little bit more and use different types of black, it ends up feeling a little bit too muddy and scrunched together. I tried to figure out if I was going to be able to make time to do another version of this to redo it, but I was a little bit more strapped for time for this episode, so I wasn't able to make that time. And again, I do still like it enough. It's just for the concept of this drawing, I feel like I should have made it way better. This might be one of those drawings that a year or two from now, I take it and redo it in an episode of redrawing my old artwork. I do make a few tweaks after the recording's done to try and separate out some of the limbs from the ones behind them so that they're separated a little bit more and can be more distinguished more easily, but it still doesn't quite come together as well as I would have hoped. But maybe I'm just being too hard on it. Maybe I'll look at it in a few days and like it more, but hopefully you all like it more than I do. Let's take a look at the finished result.
Voila! Dreamworks animated characters as beasts. Please let me know in the comments if there's another set of characters that are kinda like these ones that you'd like to see turned into monstrier versions of themselves. I mean, I have done lots of this on the channel that you can already find, but there's no shortage of other characters out there that I could use. If you are new to the channel, you might want to check out my famous Kids TV characters as beasts episode. That's a particularly good one in my opinion. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is another quote from Ed Milet, who says that you don't have to have it all together to help other people. The stuff that I say at the ends of these videos, for instance, is all stuff that I'm actively practicing, not stuff that I'm always able to do all the time. There's no real peak to the mountaintop where you're ever done working on yourself. There's always another level you can get to, and you don't have to have mastered something to help someone else start getting better at it. And in fact, if you want to do something like a channel like this or something, people will enjoy watching your stuff more later on if they can see the progress you've made. It'll be more inspiring than just going to a channel that's been almost perfect from the very beginning. I hope that's inspiring to someone out there. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Goodbye.